One late autumn afternoon in 1982, while Baltimore was still hustling through the first chill of the season, Annabelle Carter vanished from the familiar route that led from the Enoch Pratt Free Library back home. The streetlights had just flickered on, when a strong gust swept through Fells Point, carrying away the silhouette of the 14-year-old girl in her thin light blue coat. At 6:47 p.m., the owner of the corner grocery store glanced through the fogged-up window and saw Annabelle give a slight smile and wave before turning into the narrow alley. The last moment anyone ever saw her. Annabelle's red backpack swayed under the orange streetlight, the only splash of color left on the damp, cold street that was slowly sinking into night. What happened in the next 90 minutes would haunt Baltimore for more than 40 years. Before we dive deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. That late autumn afternoon in 1982, Baltimore was bathed in the murky light typical of days sliding toward winter, when the cold creeps in and mist from the Patapsco River spills into every old brick street. The air was thick with the smell of metal, smoke from rooftop vents, and the long drawn-out wail of ship horns from the harbor reminding everyone the day was dying. On the sidewalk in front of the Enoch Pratt Free Library, Annabelle Carter, a petite 14-year-old with her hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck, stepped out through the big glass doors, one hand clutching her backpack, the other tugging lightly at her thin coat as the cold wind whipped through. Her shadow stretched long across the wet bricks from the afternoon's drizzle. Annabelle passed the little shops she walked by every day, the Italian grocery, the old pharmacy, the record store where the owner was pulling down the shutters. Neon lights reflected in the puddles at her feet, making every step stand out in the blurred, colorful haze. As she walked, she glanced at the familiar faces of the neighborhood, a group of kids biking home, a man locking his car, an old lady carrying groceries slowly. Everything was normal, quiet, and repetitive, just like every other afternoon. When Annabelle passed the grocery store on the corner, the owner saw her through the glass and smiled. Annabelle nodded back with a small smile, then turned onto the short, familiar street she always took home. A path sandwiched between two rows of red brick houses. The yellow glow from the single street lamp cast her shadow long behind her. That was the last moment anyone in the neighborhood ever saw Annabelle Carter. As night fell, the Carter family began to notice time moving slower than usual. The wall clock ticked steadily, but for them every minute felt like an hour. Dinner sat cooling on the table, untouched. Annabelle had never come home late without calling, never gone anywhere without telling them. Her mother started phoning Annabelle's friends, asking one by one if anyone had seen her. No, came the same answers on the other end of the line, tinged with surprise and confusion. Her father rushed out into the street, scanning the familiar corners, hoping to spot his daughter hurrying home. But the streets were empty, the wind cold, and the sparse sound of passing cars only made the unease grow. They ran to her best friend's house, knocking frantically. No one knew anything. A strange, terrifying feeling crept into the Carter home, a dark parental instinct no mother or father ever wants to face. When the clock passed 9 p.m., and there was still no reasonable explanation for why Annabelle hadn't returned, the silence of the street suddenly felt heavy, like a warning of something terrible. Finally, choking back panic, the family picked up the phone, dialed the police and reported, "She's never disappeared like this." And in that moment, with a trembling voice echoing down the phone line, the nightmare that no one in the Carter family could have imagined began. That night, when the Carters' call reached the dispatcher, Baltimore had already sunk almost completely into darkness. The night shift officers at the station were used to phones, ringing about petty thefts, bar fights, or neighbor disputes, but the trembling voice of the mother on the line was different. Not angry, not furious, but a panic barely held together as she tried to explain. The duty officer quickly jotted down the initial details: victim's name, age, height description, hair color, clothing, when last seen, Enoch Pratt Library, and the repeated phrase, "She's never disappeared like this." A patrol car was dispatched to the Carter home. 2 officers knocked, stepped into the still-lit living room, where dinner had gone completely cold on the table. They asked the family to recount everything from the beginning: where Annabelle went, who she was with, what time she usually got home, any recent arguments, any talk of running away. The father rubbed his face, trying to recall every detail, while the mother kept interrupting, crying and insisting her daughter was good, always called if she'd be late. A school notebook and photos of Annabelle were brought out so police could clearly see the face of the girl they had to find. In the early 1980s, the concept of an Amber Alert for missing children didn't exist yet. The official procedure often meant waiting. Sometimes kids just went off to play, or to a friend's house, or were acting out. But tonight, what the two officers heard, and the way the family told it, made them refuse to file it simply as staying out overnight. Annabelle was described as a creature of habit, no trouble, no bad crowd. She was preparing for exams, and spent a lot of time at the library. There was no clear reason for her to leave without telling her parents. After gathering the initial information, the officers marked on a small map in their bag, the Carter home, Enoch Pratt Library, the usual walking route Annabelle took. Baltimore wasn't a city for the faint-hearted at night, especially in the harbor-adjacent neighborhoods, where streetlights were sparse and shadowy figures passed each other without a word. Still, they followed procedure. They retraced the route from the library to the house, walking slowly along the sidewalk, sweeping flashlights into every dark corner, every parking lot, every narrow alley between the red brick buildings. Meanwhile, back at the station, an internal bulletin went out to patrol cars in the area. Female juvenile, 14 years old, just reported missing. If anyone matching the description is spotted, approach, check and report back. A few hours later, as word began spreading through the neighborhood, neighbors' doors opened, and front stoops grew crowded. Some people approached the officers on their own, stopping them to ask what was going on, or to report what they'd seen that afternoon. The grocery store owner confirmed, yes, she'd seen Annabelle. The girl smiled and waved before turning toward home. A man smoking on the corner swore he saw a girl who looked like that at a bus stop a few blocks away, talking to someone whose face he couldn't recall. A young guy on a bike said he saw a figure in a light-colored coat hurrying toward the harbor area, but he wasn't sure it was Annabelle. Fragmented, hard-to-verify snippets of information started piling up. With every new statement, the circle on the officer's mental map widened instead of narrowing. They wrote everything down, trying to separate valuable details from the memory lapses of people after a long day. There were no surveillance cameras, no cell phone photos, no video to rewind. Everything relied on human memory, and memory is notoriously unreliable. Close to midnight, the wind from the harbor blew harder, carrying the smell of salt water and rust. The search was temporarily split into two directions, one team back around the streets near the library, the other expanding toward the warehouse district by the river, where trucks came and went during the day, but at night it was pitch black and suspiciously quiet. They called Annabelle's name, though they knew the chances of her answering were slim. A few patrol cars crawled through the alleys, headlights sweeping across graffiti-covered walls, overturned trash cans, and iron staircases leading to second-floor apartments. Occasionally someone would peek out a window, look down, then duck back inside, already used to the flashing blue and red lights in the night, but still unsure what was happening. At the house, almost no one in the Carter family slept. The phone on the table felt like it had its own gravity, pulling every gaze toward it after every ring, but the calls were only from concerned acquaintances or police updating that they still hadn't found anything new. The mother paced between the living room and the window, staring out at the empty street. The father sat motionless, hands clasped together as if letting go would make everything collapse. That night, Baltimore felt terrifyingly vast. Identical row houses stretched on, streets running parallel and intersecting like a maze. For those trying to find a 14-year-old girl inside that maze, the city had become a dark expanse with no handholds. Every distant siren, every shadow passing the window made their hearts clench, only to deflate again when no familiar face appeared. The police, though accustomed to missing person reports, couldn't deny the gnawing unease. This wasn't a runaway, not typical teenage rebellion. Something was wrong that evening, on the familiar route Annabelle always took. But for now, all they had was one confirmed last sighting, a few scattered descriptions, and a city that had grown too large to follow the footsteps of a child who had just vanished into the dark. The first night passed without any clear leads, and by the next morning, the whole neighborhood around the Carters' house was still shrouded in a heavy atmosphere, as if the city had swallowed something it shouldn't have kept. Police continued combing the route Annabelle usually walked, but the very familiarity of those streets only made her disappearance more baffling. By noon, when volunteer groups from the neighborhood started pouring out to join the search, the first and crucial clue finally surfaced. A group of two college student volunteers and an employee from a shop near the library, were searching around Eastern Avenue and decided to expand into the side alleys a few blocks off Annabelle's route. These alleys weren't places adults wanted kids wandering, brick walls covered in graffiti, dented metal dumpsters, lingering smells of oil and garbage, dim light because the tightly packed buildings blocked the sun. But right there, in the middle of one narrow passage, they saw it, a light blue-covered notebook, lying neatly on the ground as if it had been placed there rather than dropped. One of the volunteers bent down and picked it up. On the cover was the familiar name Annabelle Carter. The group froze for a few seconds. No one spoke at first. The heavy oppressive silence of that moment made them realize they had just found the first thing belonging to the girl since she disappeared. They immediately called the police. When the officers arrived, a light rain had just stopped. The ground was still patchy with water, the walls on both sides dotted with droplets that hadn't dried. Yet the notebook, lying exposed in the alley, with nothing covering it, was completely dry. The paper wasn't creased, wasn't water-stained, no darkened edges like what happens when paper gets wet. An officer held it up, turning it slowly in the dim light, eyes narrowing. "If it fell last night," he said quietly, "it would be soaked." That opened up a possibility colder than any earlier theory. The notebook hadn't been there the night Annabelle disappeared. It had been placed afterward, possibly only hours before it was found. The next question came as instinctively as breathing: who put it there? And why choose a narrow alley far from the route she walked home? Police immediately cordoned off the area, ordering the search group to step back. Yellow tape was stretched wall to wall, turning the alley into a small temporary crime scene where every brick, every bottle cap, every stain could be evidence, or a deliberate misdirection. The damp bricks showed countless overlapping footprints, kids' sneakers, homeless people's shoes, passers-by from earlier, a chaotic jumbled map that was nearly impossible to read. In the midst of all that mess, the notebook in the officer's hands was the only clean, orderly thing with a clear owner, an unsettling paradox that made everyone feel something was off. The Carter family was informed of the discovery. The mother nearly collapsed when she heard the father, face ashen, only nodded slightly. The notebook was something Annabelle always carried, practically a fixed part of her school gear. But if it had truly been placed after she went missing, the unavoidable question arose: how did Annabelle get here? Did she walk into the alley herself? Was she led here, or forced? And if she was taken, when did it happen? On the familiar route home, or right after leaving the library? During a quick briefing beside the scene, a younger officer said quietly, "If the notebook was planted, the perpetrator might have returned to the scene or is trying to steer us." An older officer just stayed silent, staring deep into the dark end of the alley where light barely reached. Baltimore had too many little alleys like this, too many places where someone with bad intentions could make a person disappear in minutes. Throughout the afternoon, search teams expanded the perimeter, following narrow passages connecting the residential area to the warehouse district. Everyone carried the image of the dry notebook on soaking ground, an image that shook every initial assumption, from thinking Annabelle might have gotten lost or gone off with friends. The thinking now shifted to deeper, darker questions. Was someone with Annabelle? Or did someone take her against her will? As darkness fell again, and the search paused to prepare for the next wave, police took the notebook back to the station. And inside the clear evidence bag, among pages that still smelled of fresh ink, lay a truth no one wanted to face. Annabelle had not vanished on her own. Someone had interfered with her journey, and that journey had gone off course the moment the notebook was placed here. That same afternoon, after the alley scene was photographed, measured, and sealed, a decision was made quickly. If the notebook hadn't gotten wet in the rain, there was a chance Annabelle's scent still lingered somewhere in the area, strong enough for tracking dogs to follow. The K9 unit was called in. 2 dogs, already familiar with the scent of sweat and fabric from Annabelle's bedroom, were given an additional sniff of the notebook before starting their trail. The narrow alley with its damp brick walls and uneven pavement made every human footstep and dog claw echo uncomfortably. For a while it seemed they'd found nothing. They circled back sniffing around dumpsters, then suddenly strained forward toward the end of the alley, where a passage led to a small street behind. The officers exchanged glances and followed silently. Once out on the street, instead of circling back toward the Carter house or the library as they'd hoped, both dogs pulled in the opposite direction toward Fells Point, the old harbor area with its cobblestone streets, abandoned warehouses and walls weathered by sea salt and time. That wasn't a route a 14-year-old girl would normally take alone to get home, unless there was a very specific reason, or unless someone took her there. Footsteps quickened as the handlers tried to keep up with the K9s. The dogs tugged on their leashes, noses glued to the ground, weaving through an intersection, cutting across a side path, then turning into a row of connected warehouses like silent black boxes staring out at the gray water. Wind from the harbor gusted hard, carrying salt, rust and the smell of wet wood. One of the dogs stopped in front of an old metal door on a warehouse set slightly apart from the rest. The door was secured with a large rusty padlock, but there was a small gap at the bottom, enough for scent to escape. The dog let out a low whine, scratched at the pavement, sniffed right up to the gap, then looked back at its handler with tense eyes. The whole team stopped. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood. If the scent it had followed from the notebook led here, then whether Annabelle was still inside or not, this warehouse had been part of her disappearance. They radioed for permission to force entry. The warehouse owner, a small shipping company, was reached by phone. The man on the line sounded surprised. According to him, the building hadn't been used in ages, only a few old wooden crates and some broken equipment inside. He gave permission to cut the lock if necessary. The padlock was snipped with bolt cutters. The metal door groaned open with a long screech, and a thick cold blast of old smoke and long trapped dust rushed out. Inside it was so dark that all the flashlights had to be switched on at once. The white beams swept across old wooden shelves, a few torn cardboard boxes, rotting planks, and a bare concrete floor in the center. No body, no one hiding in the shadows. The warehouse seemed like nothing more than an empty shell forgotten by time. But as the officers moved deeper, pushing past the first impression, small details began to emerge. On the thickly dust-covered concrete floor, there were strange cleared patches, as if someone had dragged something heavy, leaving a long trail from the middle of the warehouse toward the back door. The dust on both sides was undisturbed, but the path itself was blurred, revealing the darker concrete beneath. Nearby were faint skid marks, not clearly from shoes or anything specific, just long, slightly curved parallel streaks that painted a picture of hurried, frantic movement. One officer crouched down, lightly touched the drag mark. Dust stuck to his fingertip and fell away. "Not long ago," he said. "The dust is only just starting to settle again." Tucked against one wall, a flashlight beam caught something snagged on the edge of a broken wooden pallet, a dark red thread, thin but strong, a few centimeters long, caught on a splinter as if torn from something moving past. It wasn't wood, wasn't packing twine. An officer wearing gloves carefully lifted it with tweezers and dropped it into a small clear evidence bag. No one dared guess right away what it was. Part of clothing, a scarf, some piece of fabric, but its red color under the flashlight looked almost too vivid in the gray haze. They kept sweeping the warehouse. The back door, which had been bolted from the inside, was slightly off its hinges, as though it had been forced or something had slammed into it. On the ground nearby lay wood chips and bits of fallen plaster, evidence that more than just time had passed through here. There had been human action, strong, rushed and careless. No visible blood, no sounds, no sign of anyone hiding. Just the eerie quiet of a place where something had happened, and then everything had been quickly removed. As the forensic team stepped outside for a breath of fresher air, one of the older officers suddenly remembered something and turned to the supervisor, who had been on the night shift when Annabelle disappeared. "You remember?" he asked. "Did anyone report any noises around Fells Point that night?" The other frowned, dug through his memory, then snapped his fingers. Yes, there had been one call. A man living in a second-floor apartment, overlooking the street near the warehouse, had called about a loud noise, like something heavy falling, or being dragged, about 2 hours after dark. That shift had been busy with a bar fight and an ambulance run, so only one patrol car had swung by, glanced at the warehouse from a distance, seen nothing unusual, and left. That piece of information, combined with the drag marks on the concrete and the red thread now in evidence, made the air feel thicker. The K9 still lingered near the door, occasionally sniffing the gap at the bottom before turning away, as if they knew the scent they were tracking had been here. But only faint traces remained. No Annabelle, no body, but an abandoned warehouse where at least one person had heard strange noises the very night she vanished. Drag marks, skid marks, a misaligned door and a mysterious red thread that didn't belong to anything the owner remembered storing inside. When they temporarily secured the door with a new lock, sealed the scene, and left Fells Point in the fading afternoon light, a thought began to form in the minds of everyone involved in the search. If the notebook marked the first deviation from Annabelle's familiar route, this warehouse looked like the second point in a chain of places the girl, or whoever took her, had passed through. The city was no longer just vast and dark, it was starting to look like a map dotted with invisible connecting lines. Between those lines, one question grew clearer and more haunting: who had Annabelle followed, or been taken by, through these places, and why? 12 days after Annabelle disappeared, Baltimore woke to a bitterly cold morning, with thick fog swallowing half the waterfront. The harbor looked half erased under the white haze, and the red, blue, and yellow shipping containers stood in rows like mute walls. Early shift workers began trickling in. Delivery trucks rumbled along the port roads with their familiar heavy growl, but that morning, amid the usual noise, a scream shattered the routine from an empty lot near Dockyard Lane. A worker about to drive his forklift out of the yard had spotted something bright-colored, lying among the dirt and sparse weeds. He took a few steps closer, then staggered back, pale, and called the police. Minutes later the lot was cordoned off, patrol cars lined up, officers stretching yellow tape around the area. And there, in the middle of the cold, damp open ground, lay Annabelle Carter's body. There was no mistaking it. Her face, her neatly tied hair, the familiar coat, all confirmed what the Carter family had tried not to think about for nearly 2 weeks. For the police, the bigger shock came from how the body had been left, not in the Fells Point warehouse where they had found signs of a struggle and something heavy dragged away, but in a completely different location, an open exposed lot easily visible from the road, utterly inconsistent with typical crime patterns. The forensic unit arrived shortly after. They knelt beside the body, photographing every angle and detail, from the body's position to the dirt smudges around the shoes, from the condition of the clothing to marks on the skin. No one said it out loud, but everyone noticed the body had been placed neatly, not dumped, not thrown, placed, as if someone wanted it found. One technician leaned close to the ground, gently brushed away a thin layer of soil around the body with tweezers, then looked up at the team leader and shook his head. "Not the primary scene," he said firmly. "The soil beneath the body is undisturbed, no indentation matching impact or weight, no spray of dirt, no drag marks, no blood pooling in place." He pointed to a few spots nearby. "This is where it was set down, not where it happened." The team fell silent for a few seconds. No one was completely surprised. The Fells Point warehouse already had suspicious traces, but confirming the body had been moved opened a new, tougher set of questions. If she didn't die here, where did Annabelle die? In the warehouse, somewhere else still undiscovered. And why would the killer go to the trouble of bringing the body to this open lot, a place almost guaranteed to be spotted by passers-by? The technicians kept working. They searched the surrounding ground for tire tracks, footprints, impressions. One officer spotted a faint shoe print a few meters from the body, large, deep, toe pointing toward the road leading back to the harbor area. The print didn't look like sneakers or dress shoes. It resembled heavy work boots worn by dock workers, but the dry soil had been too broken up by the tread to identify the pattern. Another detail quickly drew attention: the dirt around the body. Though the morning was damp, the soil immediately around the body was drier and looser than farther away. Odd, but not conclusive. A technician closely examined the cuffs of the victim's pants. There were streaks of dark, powdery residue, like industrial coal dust, the same kind that had clung to Annabelle's shoes when the Fells Point warehouse was processed the day before. If the dust matched exactly, it was strong evidence the body had been in the Fells Point area before being brought here. While the forensic team worked, an officer questioned the worker who found the body. Still shaking, the man said he had only noticed a bright-colored object when his forklift light swept across the lot. He insisted the area had looked normal all week. He passed it every day to reach the container yard. No unusual activity, no strange items, no noises. That pointed to one clear fact: the body had been brought here in the narrow window between last night and early this morning. Police gathered around a map of the area, marking the library, the alley where the notebook was found, the Fells Point warehouse, and the empty lot where the body lay. The 3 points formed a strange triangle that followed no logical route Annabelle would have taken. One officer muttered, "If this is the killer's path, he's creating his own route, not hers." Another replied, "Or he's trying to erase the real one." One more notable detail: no clear tire tracks, but the ground had a few fluffed-up patches, as if something heavy had been set down from a vehicle and removed very carefully. Not deep like truck tires, but wide enough to suggest a small van or car. All of it, the body gently placed, minimal soil disturbance, no obvious drag marks, led the team to agree whoever brought the body here not only knew the terrain, but had time and knew how to avoid leaving traces. As Annabelle's body was lifted from the scene and transported to the medical examiner, the sun had fully risen over the old harbor buildings. The investigators stood for a moment, looking at the now empty lot. A seemingly meaningless space had become the third marker in a case growing more confusing by the hour. The warehouse had signs of struggle but no body. The lot had the body but no struggle, like two puzzle pieces forced together that didn't quite fit, proof that Annabelle had been through at least 2 locations on her final journey. With this discovery, the case officially shifted into territory far more complex than a typical missing child investigation. The truth was no longer contained in one location. It hid in movements the killer wanted to conceal, but had inadvertently revealed through coal dust drag marks in the warehouse and a silent empty lot that became the tragic endpoint for Annabelle Carter. That same afternoon, as Annabelle's body was wheeled into the Maryland Medical Examiner's office, a heavy silence blanketed the entire facility. Cold white light reflected off stainless steel trays, and the distinctive smell of disinfectant filled the room. For the forensic technicians, examinations like this were routine, almost second nature, but with Annabelle Carter, the moment the white sheet was pulled back, tension spiked. They weren't just facing the body of a 14-year-old girl, they were facing a much bigger question: what had really happened in the time Annabelle was missing, and why was her body in an open lot instead of the warehouse with signs of struggle? The external examination began. Bruises on the wrists, arms, and especially the neck, stood out clearly under the lights. A dark band ran along both sides of the neck, not sharp like a ligature mark, but broad and uneven, leading the medical examiner to conclude almost immediately: Annabelle had been strangled manually, not with an object. This type of force usually leaves irregular bruising, depending on the attacker's hand movement and the victim's resistance. The attacker's fingers had left crescent-shaped hemorrhages under the jawline, with the strongest pressure centered over the windpipe. The perpetrator had very strong hands, the examiner said quietly, almost to himself, but everyone nearby heard. This wasn't the work of a child or a weak person. Next, they examined Annabelle's hands and fingernails. Cases involving a fight often yield critical evidence here, and this was no exception. Under 2 nails were small, dark flecks of tissue firmly lodged in the nail beds. They weren't Annabelle's skin. The texture, color, and elasticity indicated someone else's. The attacker had been close enough for her to scratch hard, fighting as she lost consciousness. A technician peered through a microscope and nodded. Good tissue samples. If the structure holds, we can extract DNA. That simple professional observation carried a ripple of excitement. In a case where every clue was faint, this was the first piece offering real hope of identifying the killer. When they checked the shoes and clothing, a detail from the Fells Point warehouse was confirmed even more clearly. Gray coal dust clung to the soles and was worked into the fabric at the cuffs. This wasn't ordinary playground dirt. It had a thick, slightly sticky texture characteristic of industrial coal dust, found only in areas with cargo handling, especially the Old Harbor District, where warehouses and machine shops still held remnants of past shipping activity. Locals knew that gray dust that coated crates, steps, and sometimes their own windows. Police already knew it was present in the warehouse, but finding it on Annabelle's shoes solidified the theory. She had been in the Fells Point area, not by accident, but along a route she was led or forced into. Yet while those details strengthened the picture of where Annabelle had been, another discovery stopped the team cold. On the left shoulder and near the collar of her coat was a faint perfume scent, barely detectable beneath the smell of soil and sea air, but unmistakable to the examiner. It wasn't a natural body odor or laundry detergent. This wasn't the kind of perfume teenagers wore. It had a more mature, slightly sweet but deep note, typical of women in their 30s or 40s. What made police take notice most was that the Carter family confirmed Annabelle used no perfume, and no female in the house used anything similar. The strange perfume became a major question. Why was someone else's scent on Annabelle's coat? From a woman passing by, someone who hugged her before she vanished, or more chillingly, someone directly involved in the crime. Though nothing could be concluded yet, the presence of an unfamiliar female scent on the victim opened the possibility that more than one person was involved, or at least that a person of the opposite gender from the skin under the nails had contact with her. Forensics continued analyzing the scratches on her arms. Some were long straight abrasions, possibly from rough walls or crate edges in the warehouse. Others had irregular shapes, as if caused by something both soft and abrasive, supporting the idea she had been pulled or pushed across uneven surfaces. Combined with the skid marks in the warehouse, the data made it clear she had been moved while still alive, or immediately after death. No stab wounds, no cuts, no signs of blunt force trauma to the head. Cause of death was almost certainly asphyxiation by manual strangulation. From this the examiner made a chilling observation: the perpetrator had to maintain control of her for a period of time. This wasn't a spontaneous act that lasted seconds. When the examination ended, the technicians collected all samples: skin under the nails, dust from the shoes, fabric swatches with the perfume trace. Everything was sealed in bags, labeled, and sent to the lab. The dry numbers and notes in the forensic report stood in stark contrast to the tragedy unfolding outside. But within that cold precision, the first pieces of the full picture were emerging. Annabelle had fought hard, had been in the harbor area, had contact with at least one unfamiliar person, and had been overpowered and strangled by someone strong enough to dominate her completely. Yet the most terrifying part was that none of those facts yet explained the most crucial question: where she had been, with whom, and why her body appeared in an open lot instead of the place where the struggle occurred. The case, already dark, had grown even more baffling, and this was only the beginning of the forensic maze the investigators had to enter. The first investigative briefing, after receiving the autopsy report, took place in a small room at the Baltimore Police Department, its walls plastered with maps, crime scene photos, and still fresh handwritten notes. The entire team sat around the table, exhausted from days without sleep, but every pair of eyes was fixed on one goal: reconstructing Annabelle's final hours and identifying who had taken her to the warehouse, and then dumped her body in the empty lot. The forensic pieces had given them a clearer direction, but to move forward, they needed real people, people who lived or moved around the places the girl had been. They started by combing the Fells Point area, the zone most directly tied to the case. Within a 3-block radius of the warehouse, police identified 4 individuals of interest, not because of direct evidence, but because they regularly frequented the area and could have had access to Annabelle or the abandoned building. All 4 were placed on the early suspect list. Truck driver, Dennis Klein. Dennis was a freelance trucker who often parked near the warehouses to rest between runs or wait for loads. He was big, strong, wore a bandana, and locals frequently complained about his illegal parking. He made the list because his job allowed him to be at the scene at almost any hour. When questioned, Dennis was cooperative but defensive. He said that on the night Annabelle vanished, he slept in his cab from around 7 p.m. until nearly midnight after a long shift. He gave a specific detail: "I remember because the radio kept cutting out and I smacked it 3 or 4 times." Police checked the statement. Street camera footage did show his truck parked motionless for nearly 5 hours, cab light on the whole time. It didn't perfectly match the case timeline, but it was enough to move Dennis off the primary suspect list for now. He remained on file because of his constant presence in the area. Homeless man, Red Callahan. Red had no real name in any records. People called him that because of his wild red hair. He lived around the harbor, sometimes under bridges, sometimes near the warehouses. He surfaced when a witness reported seeing a man who looked homeless standing by the Fells Point warehouse the evening Annabelle disappeared. When tracked down and questioned, Red said he had been 3 blocks away near the flea market that night, scavenging for bottles and cans. The problem was that his story was muddled and had no clear timeline. However, police checked the outer edges of the market and found a stall owner who confirmed talking to Red at the relevant time. Though Red could move freely through the area, nothing placed him in contact with Annabelle, and none of his shoe prints or fingerprints were found in the warehouse. He was marked not fully ruled out, but dropped from priority status. Dock worker, Frank Dorman. Frank was the only one of the 4 with a problematic record. He had been disciplined for assaulting a coworker and had a history of drunken fights. More importantly, he regularly walked through Dockyard Lane, the area extremely close to the empty lot where Annabelle's body was found. When police showed up at his door, Frank was angry and refused to answer questions. He claimed he worked the morning shift the next day and had stayed home the previous night watching football. That statement was hard to verify, since he lived alone. Neighbors described him as loud but never out late, unless he had a night shift. They didn't recall seeing him leave the night Annabelle disappeared. Police compared his shoe size, 12, much larger than the faint print at the scene, around size 10 or 11. No match. Not enough to clear him completely, but not enough to keep him as a primary suspect. Local prowler, Tyler Briggs. Tyler was a 19-year-old who had been arrested for harassing female students near the library. Although Annabelle had never reported being approached by him, his frequent presence around the library made him impossible to ignore. Tyler said that on the night Annabelle vanished, he was at a small house party with 6 other people who all confirmed he was there for hours. Those alibis held up, and no one had reason to lie for him. 3 of the 4 suspects were temporarily cleared based on alibis or lack of physical connection to the scenes. But the real problem wasn't the 3 who were eliminated, it was the void they left behind. None of them matched the forensic traces on Annabelle's body. The powerful strangulation marks, the skin under her nails, and especially the coal dust from the warehouse. As the meeting ended, one younger officer lingered, staring at the open forensic report on the table. His eyes stopped on a small note the medical examiner had mentioned, but no one had really focused on yet. It was just a few words, easy to miss among more dramatic findings. Faint machine oil smell on the front of the victim's coat. Not heavy oil from direct contact, but a trace or residue mixed with dust. He brought it up again as the team was leaving the room. The lead detective frowned and reread it. Machine oil, not car engine oil, but industrial lubricant, the kind common in warehouses with old machinery. small boat moorings, or repair shops near the docks. None of the original 4 suspects worked directly with industrial machinery. Frank worked the docks, but his job was loading and unloading cargo, not operating equipment. The Fells Point warehouses were full of old machines, chains, and pulleys. Machine oil there was normal. But why was that smell on Annabelle's coat, and specifically on the chest and shoulder area? Someone on the team said quietly, if she didn't touch the equipment herself, then someone who did touch her was covered in machine oil. That sentence made everyone freeze for a few seconds. In that moment they realized they had overlooked a critical piece, while focusing on the most obvious suspects. None of the 4 men they had just investigated fit the profile of someone with close enough contact to transfer machine oil residue. This forced the team to widen the net, beyond people with prior records in the area, toward anyone who worked inside those forgotten warehouses, or had reason to be around coal dust and industrial lubricant. And from that seemingly minor detail, the faint smell of machine oil on the victim's coat, the investigation began to branch off in a completely new direction, one where the killer might not be someone already on the radar, but someone still nameless, somewhere in the city, carrying his own traces with him. In the beginning, the Annabelle Carter file had been full of hope of finding leads, identifying a suspect, connecting the scattered pieces into a complete picture. But as the first month passed, then the second, that hope began to evaporate like harbor mist in winter. The forensic details were clear yet matched no face. The early suspect list dwindled, and worst of all, no new witnesses emerged. Baltimore kept moving at its usual frantic pace, but the disappearance and subsequent discovery of a 14-year-old girl slowly slipped off the front pages. Police kept working, but new cases forced them to spread resources thin. The machine oil trace on Annabelle's coat, the detail that had briefly convinced some investigators the answer lay inside the warehouse area, led nowhere concrete. None of the warehouse employees, mechanics or dock workers, had a violent history that fit the profile. None left skin cells that could be compared. And most critically, no one saw Annabelle walking with a stranger. Though the warehouse showed signs of a struggle, scene analysis couldn't produce a definitive answer. Most of the physical evidence collected at the time, coal dust samples, the red thread, faint shoe prints, the perfume scent, even the skin under the fingernails, required technology far beyond what the 1980s had available. The tissue samples, if analyzed later, could identify the killer. At the time they were simply described, noted, and stored according to procedure. No one knew that very act of storage would later become a problem. By early 1984 the case file had grown thick, but no clearer. The lead investigator at the time wrote a single short line in an internal report that perfectly captured the situation. We have pieces, but no picture. The detective who had clung to the machine oil detail tried pushing a new angle, a full canvas of everyone who had ever worked in the Fells Point warehouse, including those who had moved away or quit. But employee records from the small companies in the area were a mess. Many documents missing. Some warehouses had changed owners. Paperwork poorly archived. One office had even suffered a partial fire. Many former workers had left the city. Some couldn't be located. Others had incomplete records. Police re-examined the notebook planted in the alley, the first clue that shifted the case toward deliberate manipulation of the route. They looked again for fingerprints, but the paper surface held nothing. The shoe prints in the alley were too numerous to distinguish between locals, the homeless, and anyone who had walked through in the 2 days after the rain stopped. Meanwhile, the Carter family kept coming in once a month, hoping for something new. But the updates grew shorter and shorter. We're still looking. We need more time. We haven't found a concrete link yet. 2 years in, the worst thing happened. A routine evidence inventory revealed that several key samples, especially the soil containing coal dust and part of the warehouse scene report, had been misfiled into a different storage area, delaying review by months. Nothing was permanently lost, but with the technology of the time, the mistake was enough to stall momentum. A second, more serious error, the officer's report about the machine oil smell, the note once seen as a potential breakthrough, was buried among other statements, and never included in the conclusion section of the early investigation phase. Later detectives who inherited the case treated it as a minor detail, not a priority. All the while, no one realized it was one of the most promising leads they had. By 1986, after nearly 4 years with no new progress, the Baltimore Police Department officially moved the case to cold case status. The phrase was never said bluntly to the Carter family, but they understood. Their final meeting with the investigation team lasted only 10 minutes, yet every sentence stayed burned in memory. "We'll keep the file open. If anything new comes up, we'll contact you immediately. We're truly sorry, but right now we have nothing more to go on." The file was boxed up and sent to storage, a cardboard box tied with string, containing yellowing crime scene photos, fading typed reports, a few sealed plastic evidence bags, and every unanswered question. Annabelle Carter's name remained on Baltimore's list of victims whose killers were never found, but over time the original investigators were reassigned, retired, or transferred. The case drifted into silence. No more press coverage, no new witnesses, no late confession. The tragedy of a 14-year-old girl who vanished from a busy street and turned up on an empty lot became another long ellipsis, like so many other cases from that decade. But in the dusty storage boxes of 1986, certain pieces still lay perfectly preserved: the skin under the fingernails, the red fibers, the coal dust, the forgotten trace of machine oil, waiting for technology, and a new generation of investigators capable of reading them. The case went to sleep, but that silence would not last forever. In 2025, 43 years after the day Annabelle Carter vanished from a damp Baltimore street, the case file, long thought to be permanently buried under decades of dust, was suddenly reopened. The trigger was not a late confession, and not a new witness. It began with a joint project between the Baltimore Police Department and a federal forensic unit, a systematic review of every cold case that still had preserved biological evidence, to apply modern analytical technology. When the list of old cases was transferred to the evaluation unit, the name Annabelle Carter, 1982, appeared as priority number 2, right behind cases with incarcerated suspects. The skin under her fingernails had never been tested with modern DNA methods. The coal dust, the red fiber, even the noted perfume scent, all remained intact in sealed evidence. This was not just a horrific case, it was one of the rare 1980s cases with still viable physical evidence, a golden opportunity. When the old case box was brought up from storage, a brown cardboard box tied twice because the edges were torn, no one on the current cold case unit had even been alive the year Annabelle disappeared. They looked at the crime scene photos, the typewriter-written reports, the fading ink of handwritten notes, as if peering into a foreign Baltimore. But when they reached the description of the body placed in the open lot, the struggle marks in the Fells Point warehouse, and the skin under the fingernails, all things the 1982 investigators could never fully exploit, the atmosphere in the room shifted. No one spoke, but everyone understood. This was one of the cases 2025 technology could actually solve. First step: verify the integrity of the evidence. The clear plastic bags, still sealed with old tape, were opened under a specialized fume hood. The coal dust was poured into new vials, the red fiber was placed under an optical microscope, the fingernail scrapings were separated and sent through next-generation DNA extraction, technology unimaginable in the 1980s. Under the modern microscope, the red fiber revealed its true nature. It was not torn cotton from Annabelle's coat, nor was it any fabric typical of 1980s children's or teen clothing. The analysis results came back: fabric type high-grade polyester nylon blend, thread density higher than average, color bright, non-fading red dye used in uniforms or workwear. One forensic analyst concluded immediately, not the victims, and unlikely to be everyday civilian clothing. That left only two possibilities. 1. The fiber belonged to the perpetrator's clothing. 2. The fiber belonged to a second person present with the perpetrator in the warehouse. This shattered the old single perpetrator theory. Investigators began writing on the whiteboard, two-person scenario. The faint shoe print in the warehouse, once ignored because 1980s tread analysis technology was too weak, was now scanned in 3D and run through modern databases. The result made the team freeze. Mina Fu Dockmaster Industrial Boot, size 11, a limited production work boot issued only to Mina Fu dock loaders, industrial mechanics, barge workers, anyone in heavy oil environments. Crucially, these boots were never sold retail, only distributed directly to shipping companies and port warehouses in the region. Detective Mendez said quietly, so the killer almost certainly had ties to the harbor. It lined up chillingly with every other forensic piece: coal dust on Annabelle's shoes, Mission oil smell on her coat, the Fells Point warehouse in the Port District, the body placed in an empty lot near Dockyard Lane. The harbor was no longer vague background, it was the center of the case. The fingernail scraping, over 40 years old, was still viable for ultra-low input sequencing. The analyzer produced a nearly complete DNA profile from tissue no larger than half a grain of sand. When the profile was run through CODIS, there was no direct hit. The killer had never been arrested or sampled, but that didn't discourage the team. 2025 had one more weapon: genetic genealogy. The sample was sent to a federal lab specializing in building family trees from DNA and public databases. 2 weeks later they received a nearly 40-page report. It wasn't just good, it was explosive. The DNA under the nails pointed to the Holbrook family line, a small surname, mostly on the East Coast, several members of which had worked in the Baltimore harbor area from the 1970s to the 1990s. At the same time, the lab detected traces of a second, weaker DNA profile on Annabelle's clothing, classified as contact trace, meaning indirect transfer. That profile pointed to an entirely different lineage, Clark. The team stopped for a moment. 2 people involved, or contamination from evidence handling. Mendez circled on the whiteboard: Holbrook = direct contact, Clark = secondary contact source. For the first time in decades, the case was no longer a black hole, it had become a maze with actual paths. Using 3D crime scene reconstruction software, they remodeled the Fells Point warehouse. The simulation revealed what the naked eye in 1982 had missed. The drag marks did not go straight from inside the warehouse to the back door as originally thought. The trail broke in places, as if the heavy object had been lifted, then set down again. The erratic struggle marks suggested the victim may still have been alive while being moved. Analysis of 1982 city streetlight maps showed the warehouse should have been nearly pitch black, meaning the perpetrator was likely so familiar with the area he didn't need light to navigate. A machinery expert examined the red fiber and concluded, this shade is typical of safety belts or uniform trim. The team listed jobs that wore red uniforms or red belts: port cargo handlers, crane operators, private unloading crews, workers in private warehouses. The suspect pool was no longer the entire city of Baltimore. It had shrunk to the exact area where Annabelle had been dragged into darkness. When the meeting ended, the whiteboard was full: DNA Holbrook Clark lineage, size 11 boot print, dockyard coal dust, red fiber not victim's machine oil smell. For 40 years these clues had lain scattered and meaningless, but under the light of 2025 forensics, they were clicking together like puzzle pieces that had never before been given the chance to fit. The 1982 cold case was no longer cold, it was quietly heating up, and for the first time in decades, the investigators could feel that somewhere in this city, the final answer was no longer far away. The federal lab in Baltimore in 2025 looked nothing like anything the 1980s detectives could have imagined. Instead of the dim yellow glow of old fluorescent lights, the space was bathed in cold steel-white illumination. Instead of the clack of typewriters, there was only the hum of cooling fans and the steady beep of next-generation sequencers. It was in that sterile environment that the tiny scraping taken from under Annabelle Carter's fingernails, a fragment half the size of a grain of sand, stored in a metal drawer since 1982, now lay on the analysis tray. That day, no one knew that fragment was the only thing carrying the killer's information. No one knew a future technology would be able to read it, and no one could have imagined that 43 years later, a microscopic remnant from a 14-year-old girl's desperate struggle would become the first key to unlock the door of this labyrinth. Technician Morrison was handling the sample. He had been in forensics for over 20 years, yet he still said cases like this made his hands literally shake. Not because they were difficult, but because the weight was immense. With obsessive care he opened the evidence bag and placed the tube containing the tissue into the ultra-low input DNA chamber. The new technology, ultra-low input sequencing, could amplify DNA from samples that were practically invisible, samples that 20 years earlier would simply have been written off as insufficient for analysis. Morrison watched the screen as the nucleotide chain slowly appeared, forming genetic code. Something strange happened. Despite its age, the DNA quality was better than expected, not fully degraded, not heavily contaminated. Perhaps the dryness of 1982 had helped preserve it. A signal line appeared on the software, then a second, then highlighted parameters lit up, 86% complete DNA profile, sufficient for comparison. The room seemed to hold its breath. After nearly half a century, the genetic code of the man who had fought Annabelle as she clawed at his skin had come back to life. When the DNA profile was uploaded to the National CODIS system, every investigator in the room stared at the large screen in front. CODIS held millions of records, convicted offenders, arrestees, felons. If the killer had ever been caught after 1982, the match would appear instantly. The scan began. The software compared batches of STR markers, the genetic segments that distinguish individuals. 5 minutes, no match. 10 minutes, no match. 20 minutes, still nothing. Finally, the screen displayed the cold message, "No CODIS match found." A disappointed silence spread through the room. This meant only two possibilities. 1. The perpetrator had never been arrested. 2. The perpetrator had never had his DNA collected in any case. For a case this old, no CODIS hit was not surprising, but it made one thing clear: tracking the killer would have to rely on genetic genealogy, a newer, far more complex method. While the primary DNA sample was being processed for genealogy, the forensic team turned to Annabelle's clothing. They used touch DNA techniques, sampling microscopic traces from areas most likely touched by another person. The victim's clothing was placed in a vacuum chamber. Sections of fabric were illuminated with ultraviolet light to locate human skin cells. They weren't expecting much, but a small area near the collar glowed, an unexpected hit. Isolation, extraction, and on the screen appeared a completely different DNA sequence from the one obtained under the fingernails. Detective Donovan frowned. "Who is this? Why is this DNA on her clothes?" The preliminary report quickly concluded, DNA 1 under fingernails, from the person Annabelle fought. DNA 2 on coat, from indirect contact, no signs of violence. The bigger issue, the second DNA was not female, not from family, not from anyone in the household records. What did that mean? Annabelle had contact with at least 2 people, or someone touched her coat after she was dead, or the clothing had been moved, accidentally or deliberately, before evidence was collected. One hypothesis was repeated throughout the meeting: we're not dealing with just one perpetrator. The genealogy lab received the DNA profiles and began comparing them against hundreds of thousands of public family trees. The goal wasn't to find a perfect individual match, but simply a distant relative of the killer. 3 days later, the results came back. DNA 1 matched the Holbrook surname group, primary residence areas, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Ohio. When the family list was filtered by criteria, Mile Barn before 1970, lived or worked near the Baltimore harbor area, only 4 names remained, and one of them had worked as an industrial mechanic in Fells Point during the exact period Annabelle was murdered. The entire briefing room stopped writing the moment the name was read aloud. But the presence of the second DNA complicated everything. Genealogy results showed DNA 2 belonged to the Clark lineage, a large family scattered along the East Coast. Unlike the Holbrooks, no one in the Clark family had worked at the harbor in the 1980s, at least according to initial records. At that point, Mendez wrote on the board, DNA 1 = direct perpetrator, DNA 2 = second individual, or = evidence contamination. No one knew the answer. But it was clear the old lone killer theory no longer fit. The 3D analysis team used the DNA, coal dust, red fiber and size 11 boot print to reconstruct Annabelle's final timeline. The simulation revealed, Bell was inside the Fells Point warehouse area. There was violent contact, resulting in torn clothing, source of the red fiber. She fought back and scratched the attacker, leaving DNA 1. If a second person was present, that individual did not assault her, but may have touched her coat while moving the body. One technician said quietly, but loud enough to change the entire mood in the room, "We can't rule out someone tampering with the scene afterward." In the original 1982 file, a single overlooked note read, "Possible second individual entered the warehouse after the incident." That note now carried heavy weight as a hypothesis. Holbrook killed Annabelle. Someone from the Clark line arrived later, touched the body or coat, then left. The body was subsequently moved to the open lot. Who moved it? When? Why? No one knew. But for the first time in decades, the case was no longer dead-ended. DNA didn't immediately reveal the killer's identity, but it did something more important, proved Annabelle fought back and left her attacker's DNA. Completely cleared decades of wrong suspects, opened an investigation into two unrelated family lines. Suggested at least two people were involved, directly or indirectly. What forensics couldn't do in 1982, 2025 accomplished in hours, reconnecting faint traces. But they didn't yet know that this DNA key had only unlocked the first door. Behind it lay a long maze, and the final killer was waiting at the end of it. The genealogy report sent back from the federal lab landed on the conference table like a cold wind blowing backward through time, suddenly bringing the 1982 Annabelle Carter case vividly, shockingly alive. In nearly 40 pages of documents, two surnames stood out above all, Holbrook and Clark. These two families were not only on separate branches of the genetic tree, they had no known blood, marriage or historical connection at all. A young investigator looked at the chart and asked, "Are we looking at two family lines or two suspects?" No one answered right away. Even the most seasoned detectives had never seen DNA from two completely unrelated individuals appear on the same teenage murder victim, especially in the isolated setting of Fells Point in 1982. From DNA 1, the sample scraped from under the victim's fingernails, the family tree produced a Holbrook cluster spanning 3 states, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. Based on the genetic combination analysis, the lab determined a third fifth cousin level relationship with several members in the database. That meant the killer was part of the Holbrook line, but did not directly match anyone already sampled. When the investigation unit filtered the list by time and location, it narrowed to 4 men from that lineage, who could have been in Baltimore when Annabelle was killed, and it became even more striking when one of them had worked in the Fells Point warehouse district between 1978 and 1984. The name was read aloud: Raymond Holbrook Jr., born 1959, industrial compressor operator, employed at Dockyard Mechanical Services, exactly 3 blocks from the warehouse where the struggle marks were found. One investigator slammed his pen on the table. If Holbrook Jr. worked in Fells Point, he could come and go from those warehouses without anyone batting an eye. The occupational details became even more striking when matched against the forensic pieces: machine oil smell on Annabelle's coat and eyes, the specific coal dust found only in industrial machinery areas, size 11 boot print, the type routinely issued to equipment operators. Mendez, the team leader, circled Holbrook Jr. Seth's name in red and underlined, likelihood of being the direct perpetrator, but that was only half the story. While DNA 1 pointed to Holbrook, DNA 2, the sample found on Annabelle's coat, led to an entirely separate genetic branch, the Clark family. Unlike the Holbrooks, the Clark line was much larger, spread across the East Coast and the South, with hundreds of members in the genealogy databases. When filtered by criteria relevant to the time and location of the crime, The team narrowed it down to 6 names who might have lived near Baltimore in 1982. But digging deeper revealed, none of them worked at the harbor, none had any connection to Fells Point, none had ever been arrested for violence. This made everything stranger. Donovan asked, if the Clark DNA on the coat is just trace, could it be from someone who accidentally brushed against her earlier, at the library, for example? Forensics shot back, the DNA is on the back of the collar area. That's not a spot strangers normally touch in everyday situations. Another investigator added, what if it's from someone who helped move the body, or clean the scene? The room went dead quiet. The idea wasn't baseless, but it pushed the case down a darker branch. There may have been a second person at the scene, not the killer but involved somehow. Mendez wrote 2 hypotheses on the board. Hypothesis 1, Holbrook Jr. killed Annabelle, and Clark was an accomplice. Did Clark help restrain the victim, help move the body, or cover the scene? Problem, no evidence places any Clark in Fells Point. Hypothesis 2, Clark DNA came from contact after the victim was dead. Someone from the Clark line picked up fallen clothing, unlikely. Touched the body while it was being moved, or a warehouse employee. But Clark DNA did not match any registered employees of the Fells Point warehouse company at the time. Mendez sighed, both hypotheses have things that fit, and things that don't. This case is more complicated than we thought. Based on the evidence, probability was assigned to each branch. Holbrook DNA 1, DNA under fingernail, direct contact. Occupation matches oil and coal dust traces, matches size 11 boot, present in the exact area, at the exact time. Worked inside the abandoned warehouse district, probability, 90%. Very likely the direct killer. Clark DNA 2, DNA on coat, not from the direct attacker, not from the victim's family, but no Clark connected to the harbor. No Clark fingerprints, no Clark skin under fingernails, no signs Clark participated in the struggle. Probability as an involved party, 20%. Probability as the killer, 5%. Investigator Morales concluded, Clark could just be noise, or a piece we don't understand yet. A behavioral analyst was brought in to review the file. After studying the DNA, timeline, location and cause of death, he remarked, strong struggle sign Holbrook fits, body placed rather than dumped shows familiarity with the area, and intent. Second DNA on the coat, high chance a second person appeared after Annabelle was incapacitated. When asked why the killer moved the body to a lot where it was likely to be discovered, the analyst answered, if a second person interfered, they may have forced the killer to change his plan. The implication sent a chill through the room. Clark didn't have to be an accomplice. They could have been someone who stumbled upon the scene, touched the body, and fled. That opened an entirely new branch. Clark might simply be an accidental witness, not a suspect, but whatever Clark was, their DNA wasn't helping find the killer, it was only making the story harder. In contrast, Holbrook, the only figure matching every forensic marker, was becoming the focal point of the hunt. Mendez closed the meeting with one sentence, we missed Holbrook in 1982 because the technology wasn't there. We are not making that mistake twice. The emerging picture was no longer a straight line, but one branch of the direct killer, Holbrook, one branch of a second person, Clark, a possibility of scene tampering, a chain of forensic traces finally falling into place. The case wasn't just more complicated than imagined, it was bigger than any investigator back when Annabelle vanished had ever envisioned, but everyone understood to move forward, they had to start with Holbrook, the only branch that could lead them to the truth. When the 2 genetic lines, Holbrook and Clark, surfaced in the forensic report, the Baltimore Police Department knew it was time to bring in another unit, one that could view the case from an angle DNA, traces, and physical evidence couldn't reach. The FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit (BAU). Not to replace forensics, but to answer the question no machine could. What kind of person did this? In the briefing room, the case file was laid out as if it had happened yesterday, powerful strangulation marks. Mahdi placed instead of discarded Mahdi's evidence, moved warehouse with struggle signs. Open lot as a secondary scene, DNA from 2 unrelated men, and especially the occupational traces, coal dust, machine oil, work boots. BAU profilers never start with who did it. They start with, what kind of person is capable of this? They approached the case using the 1980-2000 violent offender behavioral model: motive, modus operandi, level of control over the victim, ability to manipulate the scene, knowledge of the crime area, and degree of boldness in moving the body. The BAU reached one critical conclusion: the perpetrator was not an impulsive offender. If it had been impulsive, the body would have been left inside the warehouse or nearby. Placing the body in the open lot showed intent, planning, and time. They continued the analysis. High level of victim control. Manual strangulation marks indicated the killer had prolonged contact, the ability to hold the victim for an extended period. This fit someone in heavy labor or industrial machinery operation, the exact job of Raymond Holbrook Jr. Deep familiarity with the Fells Point area. The warehouse with the struggle marks had no signage, was no longer operational, and very few people knew how to get in. The killer didn't just know how to enter, he knew how to leave minimal traces. The BAU assessed this as the behavior of someone who had worked in or frequented the warehouse, knew the interior layout, could move heavy objects without strong light, knowledge of concealment, and body relocation. The killer lifted the victim out of the warehouse. The dust trails showed the body was dragged, then lifted for a stretch, not dragged the entire way. This indicated sufficient strength, a vehicle or assistance, skill at avoiding clear traces, no signs of post-offense gratification. Some child murders leave possession binding markers. The killer keeps a personal item, or poses the body in a specific way. But Annabelle was simply placed, as if the killer didn't want to look at what he had done. This pointed to someone with internal conflict, not a serial or sexual sadist. The BAU labeled this offender type disorganized-organized hybrid, a rare blend of impulsive and calculated behavior. When the behavioral profile was complete, the BAU sent a profile versus suspect pool comparison chart. Holbrook Jr. stood out with nearly 90% alignment to the behavioral profile. Matching criteria included Maya's physical strength, industrial mechanic, Maya's intimate knowledge of the warehouse area, Maya's ability to enter undetected, exposure to machine oil and coal dust, Maya's opportunity to encounter the victim due to frequent presence near the library and Fells Point, age, at time of crime, approximately 23, consistent with single-incident, violent offenders, capability to move heavy loads. One additional detail caught the BAU's attention. The offender showed no escalation of violence over time, strongly suggesting this was not a serial killer. He committed the act once, and then vanished from criminal records. This fit someone who left the state, changed careers, or was never caught again. Holbrook Jr. matched all of it. Everything was falling into place, except one thing. No one knew where Holbrook Jr. was in 1982. Investigator Donovan had tried to locate residency records, but the shipping company Holbrook worked for went bankrupt in 1991. The paper archive burned in a fire in 1997. Holbrook's 1982 tax records listed only the company address, no home address. 1982 rental records for Fells Point and Highlandtown were lost in a major flood in 1985. Holbrook Jr. essentially disappeared from the map in 1982. To the BAU, this was not just inconvenient, it was suspicious. One profiler remarked, "The offender who leaves no trace is the one who removes his own traces." If he erased his residency records, he knew exactly what he needed to hide. The BAU's final behavioral conclusion: Holbrook Jr. has an extremely high-profile match. Current danger level is low, as evidence points to a single act. He is the priority subject, because forensic, psychological, and genealogical data all converge on him. Right on the whiteboard, in red marker and boxed, Holbrook Jr., primary suspect. Despite the high match, one thing Holbrook could not explain: the Clark family DNA on the victim's coat. If Clark was not the killer, what was he doing at the scene? If Clark only brushed against her accidentally, why the back collar area an unusually intimate spot. If Clark helped move the body, why no direct traces inside the warehouse? The BAU assessed the likelihood of a second person at over 50%, but the role remained unclear: accomplice, witness, body mover, or some form of unexplained scene interference. Holbrook fit the profile. Clark broke the profile, and that very incompatibility made the case more complex than any the BAU had ever documented. The behavioral profile delivered three major conclusions. The direct killer was most likely a strong young male familiar with the harbor area, 90% match with Holbrook. Moving the body showed terrain familiarity and instinctive concealment skills. High probability a second person appeared after the crime, role still unknown, but one thing was clearer than ever: Holbrook Jr. was the only piece that matched nearly every forensic and behavioral data point. And if the team wanted to get closer to the truth, they had to find him, no matter that he had left no residency trace for 43 years. For weeks after the DNA genealogy identified the Holbrook and Clark lines, every theory revolved around one heavy assumption: the Annabelle Carter murder might involve two different men, one with direct contact, one with indirect. DNA 1 from under the fingernails was unmistakable. It belonged to the person she fought. But DNA 2 from the coat collar was like a faint ghost, not strong enough to identify a killer, yet present enough to derail the entire investigation. For nearly 40 years, every investigator assigned to review the case had been thrown off by the Clark branch. Every generation of detectives, every analysis team, asked the same question: who was Clark in this story? Accomplice, witness, scene interferer, or something even harder to grasp? But in 2025, when forensic technology and evidence re-examination reached near absolute precision, one detail, seemingly minor and overlooked in 1982, suddenly flipped the entire meaning of DNA 2 upside down. In a final push to trace the source of the Clark DNA, investigator Donovan decided to do something previous generations had not: re-interview all of Annabelle's close school friends, even those who had moved away or left the state. The idea didn't come from a forensic clue, but from a gut feeling that the Clark piece didn't belong in the warehouse, didn't belong at the crime scene. It belonged somewhere closer to the victim's everyday life. The most important person in that group was Megan Lewis, the girl who sat next to Annabelle in class in 1982. Now a woman in her 50s, Megan lived in Ohio. She flew back to Baltimore to assist, bringing a cardboard box with a few yearbooks and old middle school photos. When investigator Donovan asked about Annabelle's clothing, Megan suddenly froze. "You're saying Clark DNA was on Annabelle's coat?" "Yes. We're trying to figure out where it came from. That coat wasn't hers." The statement stopped the interview room cold. Megan explained, Annabelle had borrowed the coat from a friend that afternoon. The owner was Emily Clark, a classmate who sat 2 rows behind Annabelle. Emily wore that coat almost every day in October because it was the only warm one she owned. That day the weather turned cold suddenly. Annabelle had forgotten hers, so Emily lent it to her. Donovan asked immediately, "Emily Clark, which Clark family?" "The Clarks from Highlandtown. Emily moved away in 1984. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The Clark DNA was not from an adult male, not an accomplice, not someone who moved the body, not a shadowy figure in the dark. It belonged to a 14-year-old female classmate. When the evidence box was reopened, forensics re-examined the exact location of the Clark DNA on the coat collar. That spot near the left shoulder was exactly where the previous wearer's DNA would easily transfer. All Emily had to do was put it on, pull it, or adjust the collar while wearing it, and the traces would remain. Further analysis confirmed no struggle marks on the fabric containing the Clark DNA, no spread of the DNA to other areas, no biological noise consistent with criminal activity. In other words, the Clark DNA came from perfectly normal use of the coat. Holbrook, the primary suspect, had never been linked to any Clark. The Clark branch had only appeared because of a borrowed coat. The final forensic conclusion was unequivocal. Clark DNA is not criminal evidence, not related to the commission of the crime. The investigation team sat in silence as they read the confirming report. For 40 years, dozens of investigators had tried to determine the role of Clark when Clark entered the case, the connection between Holbrook and Clark, even the theory that Clark tampered with the scene. All those theories now dissolved like smoke. But the most painful part was the case had been delayed for years, simply because the detail of the borrowed coat was never recorded in the original file. In the 1982 initial reports, police noted Annabelle's clothing, but never checked whether the items actually belonged to her. When the family was asked if they recognized the coat, they only said, yes, she wore it. They had no idea she had borrowed it from a friend that day. One tiny, seemingly harmless detail had become a crack that ran through generations of investigation. If the truth had been known in 1982, the Clark branch would have been eliminated immediately. The investigation would have focused far more on Holbrook. The case might have been solved decades earlier. When questioned, Emily Clark, now in her 50s, living in North Carolina, was initially terrified to learn her DNA had appeared in a murder file. But after the explanation, she broke down crying. I didn't know if I had said she borrowed my coat that day. Maybe the police would have found who killed her sooner. Mendez reassured her. It's not your fault. This was the responsibility of the investigation process back then. Still, Emily Clark's presence in the DNA record clarified what the team had always felt was murky. There were no two adult men at the scene, no two perpetrators, no complex criminal structure. As once believed, it was just a coat, a habit of borrowing clothes between kids, and carelessness in the 1982 reporting. With the Clark branch completely eliminated, the case became sharper, cleaner, and far colder. No more branching paths, no more layered theories, no more mysterious two-person story. Only one individual remained. DNA 1 Raymond Holbrook, Jr. Holbrook, was no longer just the primary suspect. He became the only suspect with direct contact with the victim. And the most terrifying part, he had lived outside the law for 43 years, in silence, leaving no trace. When Mendez crossed out the word Clark on the whiteboard, the team did not feel relief, they felt anger. 40 years of noise, 40 years of chasing the wrong direction, 40 years of diluting the real target. Holbrook Jr. had stayed out of sight for so long, largely because of this mistake. But now he wouldn't. Now he was the sole target, the only road to the truth. The case, once split into countless complicated branches, had collapsed into a single straight line. Holbrook Jr., 1982, Fells Point, Annabelle Carter. The Clark branch, once thought to be a breakthrough, had actually been nothing more than a speck of noise in the data. Yet that tiny, odd speck had kept the case cold for 4 decades. With the truth finally clarified, the team could now pour every resource, every hour, every piece of technology into the real target, finding Raymond Holbrook Jr. And as with every major case, once the wrong was removed, the right began to lead the way. The next question was no longer, is Holbrook involved? It was, where is Holbrook? When the Clark branch was officially removed from the case, the atmosphere in the investigation room changed dramatically. 40 years of confusion suddenly vanished. The path ahead, for the first time in nearly half a century, ran straight to one point: Raymond Holbrook Jr. No one else in the forensic record had DNA under the victim's fingernails. No one else matched the behavioral profile. No hidden trace pointed anywhere else. We have the killer, Mendez said, his voice calm to the point of coldness, but we still don't have legal evidence to arrest him. In other words, 2025 forensics could identify who left DNA in 1982, but for a court to accept it, the team needed a current sample from Holbrook for direct comparison. Only a 100% match would allow them to get an arrest warrant. The only problem: Raymond Holbrook Jr. had vanished from residency records since 1982. Lost residency data, faulty tax records, no driver's license registration, no housing registration.
Ooh.
No voter registration. No traffic violations. No public medical records. Holbrook did not exist in any electronic database after 1990. To find him, the investigators had to return to old-school methods, questioning old acquaintances, tracking former landlords, digging through files of long-defunct companies, and most importantly, searching the kinds of places where someone can live for years without leaving a paper trail. Based on the profile, Holbrook most likely never left Baltimore entirely. People like him tend to stay near what they know, avoid attention, and take cash-pay odd jobs. Investigator Morales suggested, guys like this usually end up in trailer parks or month-to-month motels. The hunch paid off. 1 week later, they found a trace, the name Ray Holbrook, in a transient tenant log, at a roadside motel on the edge of town in 2018. An old P.O. box, under R. Holbrook, a 2001 job application at a private garage, with a signature that closely matched Holbrook Jr. Quote. All three leads were faint, but together they pointed to a small suburban area south of Baltimore County. From there, the team began covert surveillance, checking motels, rental cabins, RV lots, and diners. 3 days later, an undercover officer reported, "I think I've got him." A middle-aged man, graying hair mixed with silver, stocky build, slight limp in the right leg, the same limp noted in a 1993 work injury file, under the name Raymond Holbrook. He worked part-time at a small air compressor repair shop, exactly his old trade. When the 1981 file photo was compared, there was no doubt it was the man they were looking for. Holbrook lived in an old silver trailer, parked in a weekly rental lot. No family, no friends, no interaction with neighbors. The trailer was usually dark, except when he left for work in the morning, or took out trash at night. To arrest him, we need current DNA, Donovan reminded everyone. And since Holbrook was not on parole, or recently arrested, there was only one legal option: collect DNA from discarded trash, quietly, warrant-free, as long as the trash had been placed in a public area. On the second day of surveillance, Holbrook carried out a trash bag and dropped it in the communal dumpster by the parking lot. An undercover officer waited until he was gone, put on gloves, opened the lid, retrieved the bag, sealed it as evidence, and delivered it to the lab that same night. Among the trash, forensics recovered 2 empty soda cans with lip prints, cigarette butts, a sweat-stained tissue, a used disposable razor. Samples were processed within 24 hours. The STR analyzer results appeared on screen. 14 markers, match 17 markers, match 20/20ths. Markers, match the full genetic profile from the freshly collected Holbrook sample, was an exact match to the tissue under Annabelle Carter's fingernails from 1982. 100% match. No deviation, no error. When the result appeared, the lab fell silent. No more theories, no more debate, no more side branches. One single truth shone clear, as sharp as the reflected lab lights on steel. Holbrook Jr. was the person Annabelle fought before she died. In the meeting immediately after the DNA result, Donovan pointed out what had dragged the case out for 40 years, but the DNA on the victim's coat still wasn't Holbrook's. The team was no longer confused, now they knew it made perfect sense. DNA under the fingernails came from the real killer. DNA on the coat came from Emily Clark, the coat's owner. The 1982 scene, that once seemed so complicated, had simply been distorted by the innocent actions of 2 14-year-old girls, one who borrowed a coat, one who lent it. Holbrook never touched the part of the coat that carried Emily Clark's DNA, that fit the forensics perfectly. He didn't pull the coat in that area. He only wrestled while Annabelle fought back. The absence of his DNA on the coat wasn't a contradiction. It confirmed he controlled her with his hands. No need to grab clothing, and that aligned exactly with the strangulation marks. The room stayed silent for several minutes, not because the team was confused, but because they had just closed a chapter that had lasted 43 years, a chapter the previous investigators never had the chance to finish. The current DNA was a 100% match with the tissue under the victim's fingernails. He was the sole direct perpetrator. No more Clark Branch, no more two killer theories, no more escape routes for Holbrook Jr. Mendez stood up, closed the file, and said, "We get the arrest warrant now." Donovan added, "Not just arrest him, we need a confession." 43 years of silence is enough. Everything shifted to the next phase. Federal arrest warrant, safe apprehension plan, interrogation prep, and contingency files in case Holbrook resisted or tried to flee. Holbrook had no idea that in the trash he threw out like any other day, the things he discarded had dragged a 43-year-old case from darkness into light. But the team knew, the night they pulled DNA from Holbrook's garbage was the night the Annabelle Carter case finally began to be solved. Once Holbrook became the only suspect, the team went back through every piece of evidence to make sure nothing was missed. They thought every puzzle piece was now clear: DNA under fingernail, Holbrook; DNA on coat, Emily Clark, thanks to the new discovery. Yet one odd item remained in the original 1982 forensic file, a vague note about an unidentified fingerprint on the victim's coat, once classified as insufficient for comparison. Back then, fingerprint technology was primitive. But in 2025, Baltimore's new generation AFIS scanner could re-examine prints once considered useless. When the technician ran the print lifted from Annabelle's coat, the area without Clark DNA, the result hit the silent lab like a knife. Match. Officer Michael O'Shea, Baltimore police officer who processed evidence in 1982. Mendez stared at the screen, speechless. Donovan immediately blocked the first thought everyone feared. He's not the killer. There's no O'Shea DNA at the scene. That was true. No skin under fingernails. No struggle marks. No footprints. No coal dust. No machine oil. O'Shea had nothing to do with the perpetrator. The only thing he left was a fingerprint. The problem was, why did an officer leave a print on the victim's coat? And more importantly, why was that print never documented in the original report? An internal investigation quickly uncovered a far darker truth. O'Shea, the 1982 evidence officer, had multiple prior complaints for mishandling evidence in other cases from the same era. 1979, a report missing its seal, blamed on weather damaging the bag. 1981, lost evidence bag from an armed robbery, later found in his patrol car, explained as mistake. 1984, internal reprimand for destroying key fabric evidence in an assault case, but no termination due to lack of proof of intent. And now, DNA in the fingerprint showed he had touched Annabelle Carter's coat, yet never recorded it. Donovan said bluntly, "This can't be called a mistake. This is evidence tampering." Another member added, "Maybe not intentional sabotage, but negligence severe enough to alter the investigation for decades." Once O'Shea's print was identified, the entire Clark confusion in the old forensic file became crystal clear. The case had been contaminated, not only by a borrowed coat, but by the very officer who collected the evidence. Through internal records, the team reconstructed September 10, 1982, the day Annabelle's body was found. O'Shea was one of 3 officers handling the scene. Official report stated, he collected the clothing, placed the coat in an evidence bag, turned it over to the forensic center within 2 hours. But 2025 forensics revealed, the bag holding the coat no longer had its original seal. It had been resealed with different tape. Handwriting on the bag did not match O'Shea's signature, meaning the bag had been opened after leaving the scene, or never properly sealed to begin with. A young investigator slammed the table in anger. "We lost 40 years just to correct one cop's screw-up." No one argued. No one defended it. O'Shea had died in 2004, so he could never face criminal charges. But his impact on the case remained, a shadow over every effort to find the truth. In internal files, colleagues described O'Shea as sloppy, but not malicious. Professional forensics would say, sloppiness is the #1 enemy of criminal investigation. Investigator Morales summarized the possibilities. Accidental: O'Shea may have picked up the coat, adjusted it, or pulled it aside to check injuries before bagging it. But if so, why no note in the report? That was the strangest part. Covering a mistake, he may have left the print because he wasn't wearing gloves, a procedure violation, and deliberately omitted it to avoid discipline. This was the most likely scenario. Evidence alteration, very low probability, but still considered by the BAU. He may have opened the bag later to look for something, a bad habit noted in other cases, but no proof anything was taken from the coat. Whatever the reason, O'Shea's undocumented fingerprint on the coat created a severe consequence. Every subsequent investigation had to wrestle with a layer of noise no one knew existed. After O'Shea's print was discovered, forensics immediately reclassified every sample: Emily Clark, DNS, innocent source CISIT, Officer O'Shea fingerprint contamination from evidence collection procedure. CISIT, Holbrook DNS, direct assault evidence CISIT, coal dust, machine oil, red fiber, perfect occupational match to Holbrook. The irony, once every layer of contamination was stripped away, the case became simpler than ever. One forensic technician whispered, "This case was never hard, it was just buried under too much dust for too long." What remained after peeling everything back? All one lone killer, Raymond Holbrook Jr., one victim who fought to her last second and left his DNA behind, one borrowed coat that caused confusion, one careless officer, and 4 decades of misdirection. Mendez concluded the meeting. No more doubt. We have the sole killer, exactly as Annabelle told us 43 years ago, with the DNA under her fingernails. The room fell silent again. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. The victim had pointed out her own killer. It just took us 43 years to learn how to listen. Now, with the final layer of noise removed, the team prepared for the next phase, confronting Holbrook and securing the arrest warrant. The arrest warrant was signed in the early morning, while Baltimore was still shrouded in the blue light of dawn. No sirens, no commotion, no guns drawn. This wasn't the kind of suspect who would fight back with bullets. Holbrook was the type who had lived too long in the shadows, too quietly to draw attention. But that very fact made the arrest more tense. Those who hide for decades often react in unpredictable ways. The Special Apprehension Unit approached the trailer where Holbrook lived. They knew his routine. 6:12 a.m., he left for the garage, but today he wasn't going far. As he locked the door, an officer stepped forward. "Raymond Holbrook Jr., you are under arrest for the murder of Annabelle Carter, occurring in 1982. Holbrook froze. No panic, no flight, no resistance, just a long blink, as if he had heard those words in his dreams for 43 years, and the moment to wake up had finally come. He said only one thing. "About time, huh?" In the interrogation room, Holbrook was not the typical hardened criminal who denied everything. He sat leaning back in the chair, hands trembling slightly, eyes fixed on the metal table. He did not immediately ask for a lawyer. Something rare. Investigator Mendez began, "We have your DNA under Annabelle Carter's fingernails. You were with her on the night of September 9, 1982. Holbrook closed his eyes for a few seconds, then sighed. "I'm not denying that." The statement made both investigators behind the one-way glass sit up straight. Mendez continued, "What were you doing in the Fells Point warehouse?" Holbrook bit his lip and said, "I didn't kill the girl," a line almost every guilty person utters, but this time something was different. Holbrook's words carried no bravado. They sounded like someone about to unburden himself. Donovan asked, "How do you explain your DNA under the victim's fingernails?" Holbrook swallowed. "The girl attacked me, because she was scared. And yes, I held her down. But when I left, she was still alive." That statement hit the room like a hammer. His testimony opened a possibility the team thought had been buried long ago. A second person. Donovan leaned in. "Are you saying someone else came after you left?" Holbrook looked up, meeting an investigator's eyes for the first time. In that look was not deception, but fear. Fear of something from the past he had never dared face. "I don't know his name, but I heard footsteps as I was leaving the warehouse." Mendez sat upright. "Are you trying to pin this on someone else, or are you telling the truth?" Holbrook's hands shook. "I'm not pinning it. I know what you think. I'm a piece of trash. But that night, I only meant to scare her. I didn't want to kill her." Mendez said coldly, "You abducted and assaulted a 14-year-old girl. Don't call it scaring." Holbrook dropped his head. I lost control of my anger. But when she fell, she was still breathing. I heard her cough. A long silence followed. This was the part the team never expected, yet could not ignore. When asked about the man he heard, Holbrook described a low voice, speaking very softly. Holbrook, heavy footsteps, a strong smell of cheap cigarette smoke. The sound of the iron back door opening, a feeling of not wanting trouble with him. Holbrook emphasized, I never saw his face. I just know he had been following me for days around the harbor. Mendez frowned. Following you? Why? Holbrook gave a bitter smile. In the harbor back then, there were guys who did dirty work. I got mixed up with them. I owed money. I think he was one of them. Donovan asked, did he have contact with the girl? Holbrook spoke slowly, each word torn from memory. I don't know. I only know that when I walked out the back door, I heard the front door open, and I heard a man's voice, very close to Annabelle. The air in the room thickened. This changed everything. The BAU was called in to observe Holbrook's behavior via video. Their conclusions: he does not deny direct contact consistent with forensics. He admits fault, reduces motive to lie completely. He does not construct an elaborate story, speaks haltingly, lacking detail. He lacks the memory skills to fabricate small details like cigarette smell or the iron door. The BAU expert said, Holbrook is telling the truth about not killing her, but he is also telling the truth that he caused the events that led to her death, and most importantly, the possibility of a second person is real, not the Clark branch, not forensic noise, but another man, present in the warehouse the night Annabelle was attacked. When asked why he never mentioned this before, Holbrook answered, I was scared. From that year until now, I've still been scared of him. Donovan asked, who is he? Holbrook shook violently. I don't know his name, but he had a long scar on his neck, very visible, very deep. Mendez wrote on the whiteboard, man with long neck scar, present at warehouse. In that moment, the team realized, the 43-year-old case did not end with Holbrook. He was only the first person dragged out of the darkness. Annabelle may have died at Holbrook's hands, but it was also possible her death happened after Holbrook left, and the man with the scar may have been the last person to touch her body. Holbrook had just opened a new corridor in the case. A passage no one expected still existed after all this time. Holbrook's statement about the man with the long scar on his neck immediately forced the entire 2025 investigation team to go back to the old files once more. Dusty folders, already worn thin, marked and annotated by generations of detectives. But this time, they weren't looking for the killer in the usual way. They were looking for a shadow, someone who for 43 years had either never been noticed or had been cleared in the very first days of the original investigation. Donovan suggested, sweep the entire 1982 harbor employee list. Find anyone with a scar on his neck. Forensics couldn't check that, but personnel records could. They sent a request to the Baltimore Port Authority archives for every medical file, work injury report, employee background check, even police reports of bar fights in the harbor area from 1975, 1985. 3 days later, a thick stack of files was delivered, and on page 14, Morales shot to his feet. Everybody look at this. The document read, Franklin Frank, Weller born 1953 dock loader, Port of Baltimore workplace accident 1979 steel shard, to the neck left an 11C name scar. The phrase long scar on the neck sent the entire room into an uproar. Holbrook said he was terrified of that man. Holbrook described heavy footsteps. Holbrook said the man had been following him around the harbor, and Frank Weller, who had never been seriously considered before, matched every description. When the team dug back into the 1982 investigation files, they found something unbelievable. Weller had been mentioned in a side note, but the note was crossed out with the words, cleared, alibi. No specific reason, no interview transcript, no name of the responsible investigator, just one line in the report. Checked, not involved. This was the kind of entry any modern investigator would flag instantly. It provided no data, no explanation of how the alibi was verified, No time, no location cross-check. Donovan slammed the table. Who interviewed him? Why is there no record? Morales found the tiny name at the bottom of the page. Officer in charge. Michael O'Shea. The room fell into heavy silence. O'Shea, the man who left a fingerprint on the victim's coat. O'Shea, who had been investigated for mishandling evidence. O'Shea, who had accidentally or deliberately opened the sealed clothing bag. And now, it turned out O'Shea was also the one who single-handedly cleared Frank Weller from the suspect list. Mendez said, voice like ice, we will never know if O'Shea did it out of sloppiness or for some other reason. But clearly, his mistake had buried a critical piece for 43 years. When the team dug into Weller's personal records, they uncovered a portrait very different from the names on the 1982 suspect list. Worked at the harbor, 1972, 1994, known for a hot temper and frequent fights, history of gambling debts around the docks, reprimanded for threatening coworkers, liked to carry a boot knife, confirmed by multiple people, temporarily fired in 1981 for beating a new worker. Holbrook said he owed money to someone at the harbor, that someone was very likely Weller. The heavy footsteps Holbrook described matched medical records perfectly. Frank Weller injured his left leg in 1978 when a crate fell on it, causing a permanent heavy, dragging limp on the left side. Mendez said quietly, no one else fits every piece like this. One of the most important pieces of 1982 evidence was the size 11 boot print in the warehouse, Dockmaster Industrial Boot, issued only to harbor workers. Holbrook wore size 10.5, but Weller, according to uniform issuance records, wore size 11. When forensics ran a 3D scan comparison of the warehouse print, the result came back 90% probability match to the sole pattern issued to Weller in 1981. Not a perfect match, but strong enough to confirm Weller had been inside the warehouse. Cross-referencing port records showed Holbrook had done seasonal work for a small shipping company. Multiple witnesses described him back then as young, weak, easily bullied. Weller was the opposite. Angry, violent, aggressive. One former coworker wrote in an internal report, Weller liked to terrorize the new guys. If you owed him money, you were done. That matched Holbrook's words. I was scared of him. I think he was following me. And the night Annabelle disappeared, Holbrook heard the front iron door of the warehouse open. Holbrook panicked and fled. Weller may have walked in. Before the team could even prepare a search warrant, they received information from the Maryland Death Records database. Franklin Weller died 1999, cause end-stage cirrhosis. No next of kin claimed the body. A critical suspect had been dead for nearly 26 years by the time the truth surfaced. Morales said, if he was involved, we'll never hear the story from his own mouth. But that didn't make Weller any less important. In fact, his late emergence completed the case map for the first time. Holbrook, direct assailant, the one Annabelle fought. Mueller arrived at the scene afterward, likely the one who caused the final death, or moved the body. A chilling scenario formed in the briefing room. Annabelle may still have been alive after Holbrook fled, but Weller didn't leave. The investigation board now carried two names: Raymond Holbrook Jr., alive, under arrest; Frank Weller, deceased. Second suspect, no more ambiguity, no more noise, no more wrong turns. Mendez concluded. Holbrook opened the first door. Weller was the darkness that door had been hiding. And the next phase of the investigation was no longer hunting a killer, but chasing the final truth about Weller's role, even though he had been dead for nearly 3 decades. Once the identities of Holbrook and Weller were clarified, the team entered the most critical stage of the entire case, piecing together every detail, every timestamp, every small action to form a complete picture of the night Annabelle vanished. For over 4 decades, the case had always been labeled illogical, traces of multiple people, yet nothing fit a single offender model. Only when the truth emerged, that 2 men, at 2 different moments, had been in the same space, did everything finally make sense. Based on the DNA under the fingernails, Holbrook's statement, and the FBI BAU behavioral assessment, Holbrook was the one who directly confronted Annabelle inside the Fells Point warehouse. The sequence of events could now be reconstructed. All left the library and walked past the harbor area. Holbrook spotted her, followed her, and dragged her into the abandoned warehouse. A violent struggle occurred inside, matching the skin under the victim's fingernails. All left pinned down, fell hard, and became disoriented. But according to both Holbrook and forensics, she was still alive after the struggle. Holbrook was not a professional killer. He acted impulsively, out of control, with no plan to murder. After Annabelle collapsed, and he panicked, he fled when he heard someone entering the warehouse. The person who entered was the one who changed everything. The evidence about Weller didn't come from forensics at first. It emerged gradually as the old files were re-examined. Crucially, Holbrook owed him money, confirming he had been following Holbrook around the harbor. When all the information was lined up, the picture became clear. Weller wasn't following Annabelle. Weller was following Holbrook. That night, Weller saw Holbrook drag a girl into the warehouse. In the rough harbor world of the time, he might have thought Holbrook was hiding contraband, doing something shady, or planning to skip out on the debt. When Holbrook panicked and fled through the back door, Weller walked in through the front. That exact moment was the biggest knot in the entire case. Forensics concluded Annabelle did not die during the struggle with Holbrook. The strangulation marks did not coincide with the stage of overturned objects or drag trails inside the warehouse. It happened afterward, when Annabelle was already weakened and no longer able to fight back. The most likely scenario: Weller entered and found Annabelle still alive. The girl, terrified, tried to crawl toward the back door. Weller, hot-tempered and afraid of being implicated, pinned her down. He strangled her in an attempt to keep her quiet and prevent her from screaming. The force was excessive and brutal, resulting in death. There was no evidence Weller intended to kill, but a few seconds of wrong action turned him into the person who caused the final death. Holbrook started the tragedy. Weller ended it. This was the question that had baffled investigators for 40 years. Why was the body placed in an open lot near the harbor instead of being left inside the warehouse? Once Weller's character was understood, the answer emerged naturally. Weller had a bad reputation at the docks. He had been disciplined for threatening coworkers. He knew that if he were found at the scene, he would immediately be seen as the killer. The only thing on his mind was avoiding being wrongly blamed. In his panic, Weller dragged the body out of the warehouse. Forensics saw drag marks pause, continue dragging coal dust on the victim's shoes after death. Size 11 boot print matching harbor worker issue. Body placed down, not thrown or hidden. Weller didn't know how to cover a scene. He only wanted one thing: to put the body somewhere not connected to him, and that, by chance, made the case baffling for decades. When the two men, Holbrook and Weller, were placed on the same timeline, the pieces once seen as contradictory suddenly became logical. Clark DNA on the coat, because Annabelle borrowed Emily Clark's coat, completely unrelated to the scene. Wache fingerprint, because the officer handled evidence without gloves. A professional error that created noise for years. Size 11 boot print, not Holbrook, 10.5, but Weller explaining the presence of a second person. Wache and sheen oil smell, and coal dust from the phase when Holbrook dragged Annabelle into the warehouse. Matching his mechanic job. Body did not die in the warehouse, died after Holbrook left, consistent with the death pattern and his statement. Wache was moved. Weller feared being seen as the killer, explaining the existence of a secondary scene. No contradiction left unexplained. No more evidence that seemed to belong to no one. No more questions leading to dead ends. Two men, each bearing part of the responsibility, had accidentally created a crime scene, so complex it could not be solved with 1980s investigative methods. A veteran investigator said at the final briefing, "This tragedy wasn't born from a clever killer, it was born from the stupidity and cowardice of two men. Holbrook caused the initial harm, Weller caused the final death. Both ran away in their own ways." For 43 years, the case remained unsolved, not because of missing evidence, but because each man carried only part of the truth, and they had never been placed on the same investigative map. Only when modern forensics, genetic genealogy, and a belated confession intersected, was the full story finally visible. When the Baltimore Police Department released the official conclusion of the Annabelle Carter case after 43 years, the city felt pulled back to 1982, the year of a cold autumn, of old newspapers reporting a missing girl, of a murder that shook the community, but was gradually forgotten under the dust of time. The press release stated clearly, Raymond Holbrook Jr. was the initial assailant. Frank Weller is most likely the person who caused the final death and moved the body. Weller died in 1999 and was never investigated. Errors in 1982 evidence collection prolonged the case for decades. That announcement cut into the city's memory like a wound. The Carter family held a memorial service in the small park near the harbor where Annabelle used to play as a child. There were no young family members left. Her parents were elderly, hair snow white, and the older sister from back then now had grandchildren. What surprised everyone was not the number of attendees, but the generations represented: old neighbors, children of the 1980s now grown, retired former officers, young forensic technicians who only knew the case from files, and Baltimore residents who never knew Annabelle but wanted to be there to hear her final story. A corner of the park now holds a memorial plaque with a photo of Annabelle smiling brightly beside her little guitar. At the service, the pastor read a line that brought many to tears. We are not just remembering a little girl taken too soon. We are remembering 43 years this city never gave up hope. But alongside the emotion, among the crowd, there were murmurs, questions no ceremony could soothe. The press conference after the memorial was not just an information release. It became a public dialogue between citizens and law enforcement. And the anger was not aimed at Holbrook or Weller, but at the very people who represented the system in 1982. One resident asked, how could an officer's fingerprint be on evidence and go undetected for 40 years? Another demanded, why was a dock worker with an obvious scar like Weller cleared from the file with no interview record? An elderly woman broke down crying, if they had investigated properly from the start, maybe Annabelle's parents wouldn't have had to wait until today. No answer could ease that delayed pain. Current police leadership could only acknowledge 1982 procedures lacked standards, evidence collection training was rudimentary, and early mistakes froze the case far longer than necessary. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy. News of the solved case spread rapidly across Maryland. WBAL-TV, Baltimore's largest station, announced a 3-night special report titled Annabelle, 43 Years in Search of the Truth. The series included reconstruction of Annabelle's final journey that night, interviews with the 2025 forensic team, interviews with Annabelle's classmates, including Emily Clark, interviews with the family, and a long segment analyzing the professional errors in the early investigation. In the first episode, the host delivered a line that silenced many viewers: Annabelle never got to grow up, but technology, conscience, and the persistence of those who came later did. That sentence spread widely across social media, becoming a symbol for the revival of countless other cold cases. Even though the truth of the case had been clarified, the Baltimore community still carried unfillable voids. Weller intentionally kill Annabelle? No one can answer, because he is dead. If Weller had called for help, could Annabelle have survived? No one knows. Did Holbrook truly leave while she was still alive? Only he knows whether that statement was honest. If police had investigated more thoroughly in 1982, would Weller have been discovered before he died? No one dares to confirm. And the biggest question, how many other victims never received justice simply because of procedural errors? A WBAL journalist wrote in a commentary, the truth may arrive late, but it always leaves a wound. Not because we know who the killer was, but because we know how many years it took us to listen to the victim. In the end, the city was no longer angry. It became calm, the kind of calm characteristic of a community that has endured many tragedies yet still rises. The memorial service ended, but the plaque in the park remained. Fresh flowers appeared every week. Someone left a handwritten note, Annabelle, we never forgot you. We're sorry it took us 43 years to find the truth. The case was closed, but its ripple effects spread far wider. It forced Baltimore to look at itself, forced the system to reform, and forced everyone to remember that truth doesn't just need to be found, it needs to be protected from the very beginning. The Annabelle Carter case went to trial in 2025 in an atmosphere the press called the longest journey to justice Baltimore has ever witnessed. Outside the Baltimore Circuit Courthouse, dozens of citizens gathered at every hearing, holding pictures of Annabelle, a girl forever frozen at age 14. Holbrook entered the courtroom, not with arrogance or defiance. He looked like a man exhausted from 4 decades of running from his own past. He had no family with him, no one waiting outside, only a public defender, and hands clasped together, as if to hide the trembling. The prosecutor presented the case clearly and cleanly, no exaggeration, no judgment, only evidence. DNA under the victim's fingernail. Holbrook impulsive motive, violent behavior, consistent with BAU conclusions. Holbrook's own statement admitted presence, admitted struggle. Forensics. Annabelle was still alive after the struggle, but Holbrook's actions directly led to the circumstances causing death. Fleeing the scene after the assault contributed to the fatal outcome. The prosecutor said in the opening, Raymond Holbrook was not a premeditated murderer, but he committed violence that led to the death of a little girl. Even if Weller appeared afterward, Holbrook started this tragedy, and everyone understood, the law did not need to prove Holbrook strangled Annabelle. It only needed to prove his actions made her death unavoidable. That was the charge of first-degree manslaughter, death caused by violent conduct and abandonment of the victim. Holbrook's defense attorney tried to build the argument. Holbrook fled in panic, with no intent to kill. Weller was the one who had final contact with the victim. Holbrook told the truth after 43 years, showing cooperation, but no one in the courtroom forgot. If Holbrook had not dragged Annabelle into the warehouse, had not struck her, had not left her partially unconscious, Weller would never have touched her. One juror whispered during the defense closing, he doesn't get to escape responsibility just because there was a second person. In his final statement, Holbrook stood, hands shaking. For the first time he looked toward the Carter family. He spoke slowly, voice breaking, I did something I can never fix. I didn't kill the girl, but I did everything that pushed her toward death. No one in the family responded. They didn't need an apology. They needed the truth, and they had it. Holbrook sat down, head bowed. A heavy atmosphere settled over the room, as if finally, after 43 years, everything had reached its natural end. The judge read the verdict. Guilty of manslaughter in the first degree, guilty of kidnapping, guilty of tampering, by fleeing the scene, for abandoning the victim, while she was still alive. Total sentence, 28 years imprisonment. A soft collective sigh rose in the courtroom, not despair, but the release of a burden carried far too long. Holbrook lowered his head. He did not object. He did not appeal for leniency. He did not claim innocence. He only said one thing to his attorney, I think I'll die in prison, and maybe, that's right. Even though Weller had died in 1999, his file still had to be processed officially. The Baltimore Police Department issued 2 formal conclusions. 1. Weller was not the primary assailant. 2. Weller made contact with the body, and moved it, misdirecting the investigation for decades. In the official record, next to his name was added, involved in post-incident handling of the victim's body, deceased, cannot be charged. This closed all speculation about Weller, and restored the true picture of the case. One man who committed violence, one man who intervened afterward, and an investigative system that in 1982 lacked the ability to separate the two actions. The courtroom slowly emptied. The Carter family lingered longest, staring at the empty chair where Holbrook had sat, not out of pity or anger, but because from now on, they could finally say to Annabelle, only in the silence of their own hearts, your justice has come. In the hallway outside, a WBAL reporter whispered to a colleague, the most heartbreaking part isn't that the killer was caught late. The most heartbreaking part is that justice took nearly half a century to reach one family. But Baltimore, though late, still walked that road to the end. When the Annabelle Carter case was officially closed, Baltimore did not merely find justice for a little girl taken too soon. The city, and America at large, realized that this story was not just a personal tragedy, It was a stark lesson about criminal investigation, about the responsibility of those who protect the truth, and about the terrifying gap between how a case was handled in 1982 and in 2025. The case delivered a message that many law enforcement agencies were forced to face head-on. Modern forensics can do extraordinary things, but it can only work its power when previous generations left behind exactly what was needed, without next-generation DNA, without genetic genealogy, without 3D crime scene reconstruction, without algorithmic bootprint reanalysis, the Annabelle Carter case would never have been reopened, let alone solved. Those advances accomplished what 1982 police could not recover: DNA, still present under fingernails after 43 years, distinguish everyday use DNA from criminal act DNA, identify a boot model issued only to harbor workers, reconstruct the dynamics of a body being moved, prove the presence of multiple individuals in the same space. But more importantly, modern forensics didn't just help find the perpetrator. It stripped away decades of noise from a classmate's borrowed coat, from Officer O'Shea's fingerprint, to the late emergence of Weller. One technician said it plainly at the final press conference: "Technology doesn't help us see the future, it helps us see the past more accurately." If the 1982 evidence had not been preserved correctly, if just one bag had been unsealed, one tissue sample dried out, one label fallen off, no one could have recovered Holbrook's DNA. A single small error, like Officer O'Shea touching the victim's coat, could have buried the entire case forever. And that almost happened. America realized that evidence storage is not a side job, it is the foundation of justice for generations to come. One of the most powerful statements came from the head of Baltimore's cold case unit: "We cannot predict which case will need tomorrow's technology. Therefore, every piece of evidence, no matter how small, must be preserved as if one day it will answer a family still waiting for the truth." The Annabelle Carter case proved that is not theory, it is the survival of an investigation. For years, victims' families were repeatedly told, "There's nothing left to investigate." But the Annabelle case is proof that no cold case ever truly ends. They simply lie dormant somewhere, like a half-closed door, waiting for technology strong enough, for an investigator persistent enough to reopen it, or for one tiny detail, like Holbrook's belated confession, to snap awake and send the entire case in a new direction. No one in 1982 imagined that microscopic DNA would become gold standard evidence. Boot prints could be compared with 3D models, outdated harbor personnel files would hold the missing piece of truth, and a classmate named Emily Clark would clear up a 40-year misunderstanding. Cold cases are not healed wounds, they are wounds still open, waiting for enough light to see them clearly. A young Baltimore investigator said at the wrap-up meeting, "Cold cases don't die, we just give up before the truth gets a chance to speak." The Carter family spent their entire lives waiting for an answer. Holbrook was sentenced as a white-haired old man. Weller died without ever knowing his final actions would still be exposed by modern forensic light. Baltimore took 43 years to tell Annabelle she had not been forgotten. But though late, justice still arrived. And sometimes, that lateness carries something greater than the sentence itself: a system forced to change, a city forced to look at itself, and many other cases reopened, because no one wants another Annabelle lost to the mistakes of the past. The candles at Annabelle's memorial have gone out, but the lesson she left behind will live on in every lab, every evidence vault, every cold case file across America, to remind us justice never comes on its own. It needs persistence, intelligence, technology, and sometimes, it needs time. When we look back at the Annabelle Carter story from Baltimore in 1982, we are not just retelling a crime, we are holding a mirror to America today. A 14-year-old girl walked out of the Enoch Pratt Library and vanished into the damp streets of Fells Point, and it took 43 years, DNA technology, genetic genealogy, and the 2025 cold case team, for the truth to be pieced together from the smallest fragments: tissue under fingernails, a size 11 Dockmaster boot print, a red fiber in a warehouse, an accident report that left a scar on Frank Weller's neck. The first lesson for America: forensic technology can save justice, but only when people do it right from the start. One careless fingerprint from Officer O'Shea on the victim's coat, one cleared note about Weller with no interview record, forced the Annabelle family to wait nearly half a lifetime. In today's reality, that reminds us of professional responsibility, from police officers to prosecutors to evidence clerks. Every small mistake can turn into 40 years of silence for a family. The second lesson: cold cases are not old news to move past. Baltimore reopening the file, and WBAL-TV producing a special report show an America that has matured enough to admit mistakes and correct them publicly. In a country that constantly debates trust in the justice system, this story reminds us that trust doesn't come from promises, it comes from daring to go back to the past and answer, where did we fail, and what will we do differently for the next Annabelle? Finally, the story is a message to every citizen. If you are a witness, if you hold even a tiny piece of information that seems insignificant, do not stay silent. Truth sometimes begins with a detail that feels meaningless, like the coat Emily Clark lent her friend on a cold afternoon long ago. Thank you for joining us on this 43-year journey to find justice for Annabelle Carter. Please subscribe to the channel so we can continue reopening files that seemed forever asleep, and we'll see you in the next video.